In Starmer's eyes, he is clearly of impeccable character. He is always right. He's not, he's called Director of Public Prosecutions. But Chief Prosecutor, what does it make him sound like? It makes him sound like a figure out of Stalin's Russia.
How do you rate Keir Starmer's first 4 months as Prime Minister?
Well, the opinion polls tell us, don't they? They have plummeted in a way that looks a bit like an alpine avalanche. He's literally fallen off.
Did you catch the explosive moment when David Starkey left Keir Starmer scrambling for words on live television? It was a high-stakes showdown that peeled back the polished surface of the Labour leader's public persona. In this breakdown, we unpack the fiery exchange that set political circles buzzing. The studio was primed for confrontation as Starkey, famous for his razor-sharp commentary, squared off against Starmer, the former chief prosecutor turned party leader. From the first question, Starkey went straight on the offensive, challenging the carefully managed image Starmer projects to the nation. He drew a provocative historical comparison to underscore what he framed as an overly rigid leadership style, a remark that clearly rattled the atmosphere in the room. For a brief but telling moment, Starmer's calm exterior flickered, and the tension became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just another TV debate, it was a direct challenge to authority, delivered with precision and force, leaving viewers to decide who truly held the upper hand.
The public understands it. They feel a sense of rigidity, alienation, something strange. Both of them are strange people who have a peculiar rigidity in a job which actually demands, yes, at times you have to be immensely firm, but you have to have something tactile. We've talked about character. We've talked about that peculiar personal rigidity, the strange fact that both of them tend to reuse phrases. And Starmer's quite extraordinary.
As the pressure mounted, Keir Starmer leaned on his legal background, stressing his dedication to the rule of law in an effort to steady the moment, but David Starkey refused to back down. Starkey doubled down, arguing that Starmer's courtroom style of politics felt distant from everyday voters and disconnected from the concerns of working communities. He claimed that this tightly structured, procedural approach to leadership projected control rather than conviction, and that it simply wasn't cutting through with the wider public. As the debate intensified, Starkey raised eyebrows by drawing a sharp comparison between Starmer and former Prime Minister Theresa May, suggesting both shared a stiff, unyielding style that struggled to inspire trust. The parallel landed hard, and for a brief moment, Starmer appeared cornered, searching for a response as the tension in the studio reached a boiling point. The clash hit its peak when David Starkey unleashed his sharpest charge yet, accusing Keir Starmer of representing a new political elite detached from the everyday realities of ordinary citizens. The claim landed with force, and for a brief second, Starmer looked visibly unsettled. Pressed further, he faltered while responding to the argument that his agenda seemed more focused on select groups than the broader public, a line of attack that pierced through his usual composure. The confident, measured tone that typically defines him gave way to hesitation, revealing a rare crack in an otherwise disciplined performance. When the exchange finally cooled, one thing was undeniable: Starkey's relentless critique had found its mark, leaving the audience to weigh the impact of a confrontation that refused to pull its punches.
Starmer is something different. I made the comparison of character to Theresa May. Starmer is something completely different. He's our first totally non-political Prime Minister. What Starmer is the incarnation of all the fundamental changes that have taken place in our Constitution, a kind of behind-the-scenes revolution, and he sees the rule of law as exactly what it sounds like, a set of rules, which is a kind of how you do it.
The showdown sparked bigger questions about Keir Starmer's leadership style, and whether he truly connects with the voters he hopes to win over. For many watching, especially those already skeptical of mainstream politics, the critique from David Starkey struck a powerful chord. The exchange fueled fresh uncertainty about Starmer's electoral strength and the long-term direction of the Labour Party. Once celebrated, his background as a human rights lawyer was framed as a defining advantage, a symbol of credibility and principle. But what if that very strength has become a political obstacle? The discipline, caution, and precision that made him formidable in the courtroom may now be limiting his emotional reach on the campaign trail. This is the paradox at the heart of his leadership: legal mastery on one hand, but a growing question over whether that same mindset is holding him back from forging a deeper bond with the public. Keir Starmer's years as Director of Public Prosecutions from 2008 to 2013 forged a legal philosophy centered on the rule of law and human rights, a foundation that has deeply shaped his political approach. This commitment to principle informs many of his policy choices, particularly his emphasis on protecting human rights. Yet, according to David Starkey, that very focus has created a tension in his leadership, a perception of a two-tier system that appears to prioritize certain minority groups over the wider population, leaving voters questioning whether his legal precision translates into political connection.
Two things that really characterize this rule of law. At home, it's essentially centered on the idea of human rights. He was a human rights lawyer. In other words, you have this strange view that fundamentally you disapprove of the majority of your population. And the majority of the population can sense it, and it prioritizes minorities. So the very doctrines of human rights are leading to this extraordinary situation where there is the literal two-tier.
Keir Starmer's legalistic mindset is evident in both his policymaking and public messaging, often framed in rigid, court-like terms that can feel distant from everyday concerns. The clash with David Starkey exposed this gap, as Starmer struggled to respond to accusations of being out of touch with ordinary citizens. Starkey called out a rigidity that alienates voters, showing how Starmer's meticulous, lawyerly approach lacks emotional resonance and fails to connect with the public, especially working-class communities. What was once a professional asset now risks widening the divide between him and the electorate, posing a critical challenge for the Labour Party: how to leverage his expertise without letting legalism undermine political connection. The question remains, can Starmer adapt, or will his courtroom-trained precision continue to hold him back? David Starkey warns that we are witnessing the rise of a privileged elite operating beyond democratic accountability, shifting power away from Parliament and prioritizing the interests of a select few over the majority. Central to this elite, Starkey argues, is a rigid focus on minority rights that leaves ordinary voters feeling sidelined, and in his view, Keir Starmer embodies this class perfectly. Starmer's human rights background, legalistic approach, and apparent detachment from working-class concerns paint a picture of a leadership increasingly out of touch with everyday realities. This perception is striking a chord with disillusioned voters, and the political stakes are high. If Starmer is seen as part of a disconnected ruling class, Labour risks losing credibility, electoral support, and the very sense of representation it promises. The broader question looms large: how can the gap between leaders and the public be bridged, and what will the future look like if figures like Starr continue to be viewed as isolated from the people they serve? While Keir Starmer positions himself as a champion of minority rights, David Starkey argues that he is neglecting a more fundamental principle: the right of the majority to be heard. This critique strikes at a core tension in British politics. The Human Rights Act of 1998, originally designed to protect citizens from state overreach, has, in Starkey's view, shifted into a mechanism that elevates minority interests above the wider population. What began as a safeguard for ordinary people risks being perceived as a tool that disrupts the democratic balance. Starmer's legal background naturally informs this focus, but Starkey contends that it is backfiring, creating a growing gap between his policies and the lived concerns of voters. By emphasizing minority rights at the expense of broader engagement, Starmer may be alienating a significant segment of the electorate, raising serious questions about Labour's connection to the public it seeks to represent. The political stakes of this approach are high. Voters who feel their needs are being sidelined in favor of minority interests could turn away from Labour Party in large numbers. David Starkey, historian, claim that Keir Starmer appears disconnected from the majority strikes at the heart of a growing disconnect between the party and its traditional base. By prioritizing minority rights over broader public concerns, Starmer risks alienating key constituencies, particularly working-class voters, and undermining Labour's electoral prospects. What was once a party known for representing the people now faces a critical challenge to bridge this gap: as Starmer is increasingly perceived as focused on niche issues at the expense of widespread societal needs. Starkey's critique forces a fundamental question: can Starmer recalibrate his leadership to reconnect with the electorate, or will this divide continue to shape Labour's future at the ballot box? In a democracy, the challenge of balancing minority rights with the will of the majority is a constant tightrope, and David Starkey argues that Starmer is struggling to maintain his footing. As the elections approach, voters will weigh whether his emphasis on protecting minorities aligns with broader public priorities or leaves him out of step with the electorate. At the same time, media coverage plays a decisive role in shaping perception. Starkey contends that mainstream outlets have crafted an overly flattering narrative around Starmer, highlighting competence while downplaying missteps, a bias rooted less in objective reporting than in shared ideological leanings on social policy and minority issues. This gap between polished media portrayal and public skepticism risks isolating Starmer in a bubble, disconnected from the very voters whose trust he needs most. Voters noticing this disconnect may grow increasingly wary of both the Labour Party and the press, fueling skepticism toward political reporting. David Starkey draws a striking comparison between Starmer and Theresa May, showing how glowing coverage can persist even amid public frustration. The stakes are high. If media narratives distort reality, citizens risk making choices at the ballot box without the full picture. Into this tension steps Starkey himself, armed with incisive analysis and unflinching critiques, taking aim not just at the politician, but at the narrative that shields him. The question remains, can this academic-turned-pundit deliver a decisive challenge to the political establishment, or will the status quo hold firm? Starmer faced off against David Starkey, the historian and media commentator whose outsider edge has earned him credibility with voters frustrated by the political establishment. Where Starmer seems rehearsed and controlled, Starkey is blunt, unpredictable, and fearless in calling out entrenched power. His assertion that Starmer embodies a new ruling class strikes a chord with working-class and disillusioned citizens, exposing the widening gap between Labour and ordinary voters. Provocative yet incisive, Starkey forces a hard look at Starmer's policies and leadership, questioning whether the system truly balances majority will with minority rights. His critique is a reminder that voters must think critically, scrutinize political narratives, and stay engaged to ensure democracy reflects the people it serves.